Hi there. Tonight we drift into candlelight and whispers, a tale where footsteps echo softly on stone floors, where velvet hems brush against unseen doors, and where shadows lean closer just to listen. Imagine a figure whose hands smell faintly of violets, but whose feet carry the dust of caverns, the maiden of blossoms, and at the same time, the sovereign of silence. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see how far our little community stretches across the world, and if there are any myths or fairy tales you'd love to hear in a future episode, drop it in the comments below. Now, let's begin our quiet journey. The daughter of Demeter, goddess of harvest, grew up surrounded by golden meadows, her laughter as light as the wind in ripening wheat. Nymphs adored her, mortals whispered of her radiance, even birds tilted their heads when she sang. But beneath the soil of those fields, another set of eyes watched, a king whose throne lay far below, bearded, solemn with a crown of shadows, keeper of all things buried. He had ruled in silence for ages, until one glance upward unraveled him. On a day like any other, the flower-gatherer stooped to pluck a bright bloom, and the earth sighed open like curtain pulled too hard. From the chasm thundered a chariot drawn by midnight horses, the dark ruler himself reaching out with steady hands. She clutched her daisies tighter, because when startled, one never lets go of a bouquet. That's just instinct. And in the next heartbeat she was swept away into the yawning depths. The crack sealed behind her, and the meadow stood empty save for a drifting perfume of crushed petals. Some say she screamed, others insist she was struck silent. Either way, sunlight lost her that day. On the surface, companions blinked in confusion. Wasn't she just here a moment ago, they muttered, proving once again that even nymphs are unreliable when it comes to head counts during outings. Demeter noticed soon enough. A mother always does. She seized her torch and scoured the earth. Her flame carved through forests, deserts, ocean sides. She called into every cave and corner. Each unanswered cry carved grief deeper into the land itself. Fields shriveled, vines collapsed. The earth mirrored her despair. Meanwhile, in the cavernous halls below, the girl of spring entered a world of torchlight and obsidian. Halls stretched endlessly. Rivers whispered threats in the dark. At the far end sat a throne waiting. Beside it, the king who had brought her here. He offered jewels that sparkled with buried centuries, a crown that shimmered faintly, polished by sighs. Yet her gaze drifted upward, searching for a sky that wasn't there. She longed for grass between her toes, the gossip of her companions, the lazy hum of summer insects. But cleverness is the one gift no one can chain. She listened politely, smiled faintly, and thought, if I cannot walk back into the fields, then perhaps I can shape these halls instead. The Lord of Shadows was not cruel, only terribly orderly, a bookkeeper of souls. And in his awkward way he tried to charm her, mostly with bone jokes, which she accepted with regal patience. You'll grow used to it, he rumbled. No one leaves this realm once they've entered. She tilted her head, crownless but unbending. We shall see about that. Above, her mother raged. Torch blazing, she stormed Olympus itself. Zeus tried his usual strategy of nodding gravely and hoping the other party would calm down, but calm never came. She vowed famine upon the world until her daughter was restored, and famine did come. Mortals stared at their barren fields and whispered, are we to starve politely, or is someone fixing this? So Hermes was dispatched, Winged sandals flashing, he swooped into the gloom below, bringing with him the first breeze of the upper world the young goddess had felt in months. She nearly wept with relief at the sight, but by then a small detail had sealed her fate. 6 pomegranate seeds tasted idly in the Garden of Shadows, sweet, bitter, unforgettable. The rule was ancient. Whoever eats in the underworld must remain tied to it. The King of Shadows presented this fact with the smugness of a man who knows the contract is ironclad. Demeter groaned, Zeus sighed, and Hermes suggested a compromise. And so the rhythm of seasons was born. Part of the year in fields of gold, part of the year beneath torchlight. A daughter shared, a queen divided, yet whole. When she rose again to the sunlit earth, Demeter's tears fell as rain, coaxing green back into the soil. When she returned below, winter swept in, bare and silent, and mortals watching learned that even gods live by cycles of loss and return. Thus the Maiden of Blossoms became something more, not only a daughter, not only a captive, but a sovereign walking between light and shadow. With one hand she carried daisies, with the other the taste of pomegranate lingered. And here we pause, with the earth in bloom above and torches glowing faintly below, the same figure stepping softly between them, velvet hem brushing both grass and stone. The tale does not end with compromise. Oh no, it merely begins to stretch, like golden dough in a baker's hands, pulled thin between 2 worlds, one above glowing with life and one below murmuring with shadows. The young queen adjusted slowly. It is one thing to wear a crown in a sunlit meadow, flowers obediently nodding with every breeze. It is another to sit on a throne carved from black stone, while spirits shuffle past with the manners of confused dinner guests. At first she walked through the underworld as if through a dream, her footsteps soft, her face pale. Servants whispered, if you can call skeletons servants, wondering whether this delicate guest would dissolve under the weight of their gloom. Yet she did not dissolve. She learned. She found that silence has textures, sometimes heavy, sometimes warm. The hush of the river Styx carried secrets like a grandmother's lullaby. The torches along endless corridors breathed with little sighs, as if exhaling eternity. And in those sighs, she began to listen more than she spoke. The lord of that realm, stern, steady, more bookkeeper than tyrant, watched with quiet curiosity. He had not expected her to endure, much less to flourish. But she did flourish, in her way, planting thoughts as one might plant seeds, gently, persistently, until even the darkest soil began to soften. Above, however, the world still felt the sharp tug of absence. Her mother paced furiously across the fields, weaving famine and plenty in fits of emotion. Mortals, ever practical, began muttering about sacrifices, ceremonies, desperate prayers. They did not know they were pawns in a tug-of-war between mother and daughter, harvest and shadow. And so the seasons shaped themselves. Autumn with its sigh, winter with its hush, spring with its laughter, summer with its abundance. Humanity learned to live not in endless plenty, but in rhythm, in rise and fall. And if you listen to the wind in wheat fields, you might hear her name whispered, not shouted, just sighed, like a secret the earth is reluctant to share. Yet even within this cycle, questions remained. Was she prisoner or partner, victim or ruler? The poets could never agree. Mortals preferred her as a symbol of innocence stolen, a flower plucked by force. The gods, however, saw something sharper in her eyes, a will beneath the softness, a queenhood not given but seized in silence. The truth, as always, curled somewhere in between. When Hermes returned from one of his many errands, winged sandals scuffing the stone floors, he found her sitting not timidly but regally, weighing judgment over disputes of shades, a thief arguing with the man he robbed, both equally dead and equally stubborn. She listened, chin raised, and gave her ruling with a balance that silenced even the restless shades. Hermes blinked, for here sat not a stolen girl, but a sovereign. The King of Shadows noticed too, though he rarely said much. Instead, he cleared his throat, shifted on his throne, and muttered something about, "Yes, well, efficient rulings are important," which translated meant, "You impress me more than I will ever dare admit aloud." Meanwhile, the mortal world busied itself weaving myths. Poets loved to exaggerate. They pictured the underworld queen forever longing, forever weeping, forever trapped. Yet whispers among the dead told another story, of a goddess who adapted, who ruled with fairness sharper than any blade, who balanced her husband's solemnity with quiet wit. One tale even claimed that when Thanatos, the very personification of death, grew sullen and lazy, she cornered him with a look so fierce that even he picked up his pace. Souls crossed the river faster that week, ferryman Charon muttering with relief. For once the paperwork was timely. Above, mortals sensed the shift, though they could not name it. Their prayers shifted too, not only for grain but for guidance. Not only for abundance but for balance. They prayed to Demeter for bread, but whispered to the daughter for justice in the unseen world. The cycle was no longer simply harvest and famine, but life and afterlife. Two halves of one presence. And so she became known as the bridge, the one who wears two crowns, one of blossoms, one of ash. In painting, she appeared with torches in her hands, one flame guiding the living, one flame guiding the dead. In stories, she became the tender sprout and the stern judge all at once. Yet, if you had walked quietly into her garden of asphodels, you might have seen her kneeling, hands brushing the pale blossoms, eyes far away. Her heart still tugged toward the sunlight, toward fields of grain, toward the mother who searched still, even knowing the bargain. The tug of roots cannot be severed by crowns. And here lies the bitter sweetness of her passage, for she was never entirely here, nor entirely there, always in between, always crossing, always holding the tension like a lyre string stretched taut. It is said she sometimes laughed at the irony. "Queen of two worlds," she would murmur, plucking petals that glowed faintly in torchlight, and yet belonging fully to neither. The shades around her, polite as always, pretended not to overhear, though one or two nodded in quiet sympathy. Above, spring would return in sudden bursts, snow melting as if startled, shoots of green climbing impatiently, and mortals would sigh in relief. They would celebrate, feast, dance. But in the back of their minds lingered the knowledge that it would not last. The queen would descend again, and winter would follow her footsteps, and thus the pattern held, year after year, breath and silence, light and shadow, abundance and hunger, a rhythm eternal, carved not by fate alone, but by the choices of a girl who once clutched daisies and found herself clutching a throne instead. The story is not finished, of course, for within the cycle lies tension still unresolved, the question of who truly held the power, and whether crowns are chosen or thrust upon unwilling brows. And so, with her torch glowing faintly in caverns below, and Demeter's torch blazing stubbornly above, the world held its breath, waiting for the next turn of the cycle. This is where the tale bends further inward, towards secrets of the underworld that even the gods whisper carefully. Down in the realm of shadows, time is slippery. Mortals think of minutes and hours, but the dead, they think in sighs and pauses, in endless waiting rooms with no magazines to read. Days blur until only the rhythm of her comings and goings gives structure to eternity. At first, the Queen of Blossoms turned judge would slip quietly between chambers, her torches lighting corners where even darkness hesitated. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she commanded, and in her silence things began to shift. You see, the underworld had always been orderly. Hades ruled with precision, keeping ledgers balanced, punishments neat, torments creatively categorized. It was a system efficient enough to make even the gods above a little envious. But efficiency, while respectable, can also feel, well, a little boring. Enter the girl with pomegranate lips. She did not overturn laws or rewrite the structure of eternity, but she added something the realm had never known: patience with nuance, understanding with firmness, and yes, just a hint of charm that made even Cerberus tilt his massive heads, drooling affectionately on her cloak. It was not long before the souls themselves began whispering, not about rebellion, heavens no. They whispered about fairness, how disputes that once dragged endlessly now found closure under her gaze. A thief and his victim could finally rest. A betrayed lover could be heard. A soldier, trembling from a war no one remembered, was granted peace. And somewhere in those whispers, her name changed. No longer only the daughter, the maiden, the stolen flower. She became the hostess of many, the one who greets every soul with the dignity of being seen, even in death. Meanwhile, Hades sat nearby, adjusting his robe uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware that his title of Lord of All Below was sharing space with something gentler, yet equally powerful. He was not jealous exactly, but there was a certain awkwardness in realizing that his consort was winning more affection than his carefully organized punishments ever had. One day, as the story goes, a spirit dared to bow and thank her first before turning to him. Hades cleared his throat, shuffled the scrolls on his lap and muttered something about protocols. She only smiled, the sort of smile that said, "Yes, dear, of course," and the underworld exhaled in quiet amusement. Above, Demeter still raged and mourned, her emotions spilling into weather patterns like spilled wine staining marble floors. Fields would wither, then burst with life, depending on the tilt of her grief. Mortals scrambled to keep up, inventing rituals and festivals to appease whichever goddess might be listening that season. Sometimes they pleaded with the mother for harvests, sometimes with the daughter for mercy in death, and sometimes with both, hedging their bets like nervous gamblers. It is in these prayers that we glimpse her power most clearly. For while her mother commanded the soil, she commanded the crossing, the invisible moment between breath and silence. That power is subtle, but unshakable. After all, no mortal ever escaped it, and none ever will. Curiously enough, she did not revel in it. She wore her crowns not as glittering trophies, but as responsibilities. Spring was her gift, winter her burden. Life was her promise, death her duty. And she bore both with the poise of someone who knew that balance is not a choice, but a fate. Yet even balance can wobble, for the underworld was not without its dramas. Consider, for example, the judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, stern men who prided themselves on verdicts sharper than bronze swords. Imagine their surprise when the queen quietly sat beside them, listening, asking questions they had never thought to ask. A thief, they said, deserved eternal torment. She tilted her head and asked, "What of the hunger that led to the theft?" The judges shifted uncomfortably, their ancient authority suddenly looking rather old-fashioned. Or take the Furies, wild-eyed, flame-haired enforcers of vengeance. They adored their tasks, shrieking through the night to punish oath-breakers. But when they came to her chambers, how softly they bowed. The fire in their eyes flickered into something like respect, for she was vengeance balanced with renewal, punishment braided with compassion. They too listened when she spoke, even if it meant waiting longer before they could swoop down with their beloved shrieks. Even the rivers noticed. The Styx, once cold and merciless, seemed to flow with a slower, gentler current when she walked its banks. Cocytus, the river of lament, quieted ever so slightly, as though shameful of weeping too loudly in her presence. And Lethe, river of forgetting, seemed reluctant to wash away memories when her hands touched its surface, as if the waters themselves longed to remember her. But not all changes came peacefully. With power comes envy. The gods above began to murmur. Was this daughter of Demeter growing too mighty? Did her time below strengthen her in ways Olympus had not intended? After all, she was no longer merely the child gathering flowers in meadows. She was a queen whom the dead adored and whom the living feared to offend. Even Zeus, ever the one to keep tallies of power, tilted his thunderbolt uneasily, watching her rise. It amused him to meddle in mortal wars, but the balance of afterlife, that was a weightier matter. Still, he hesitated, for interfering in the realm of shadows was dangerous, and his brother, though calm, would not take kindly to disruption. So the tension grew, silent, unseen, but palpable. Like a string pulled tighter each season she returned below, and in the heart of this tension, she lived her duality. On the surface she was springtime's laughter, fields bursting with green, a daughter embraced in light. Below she was solemn fire, torches guiding souls, a queen with eyes that held both sorrow and serenity. And in truth, she was never entirely either. Perhaps this is why mortals dreamed of her so vividly. In her they saw themselves, torn between life and death, between joy and loss, between beginnings and endings. She was not distant like other gods, untouchable in Olympian pride. She was present in every seed planted, every tear shed, every breath drawn and released. Some storytellers whispered that she grew fond of her role, that in shadow she discovered a freedom she had never known under her mother's constant watch. No longer the eternal child, she became a sovereign, not just by marriage, but by will. And sometimes, though only sometimes, when Hades looked upon her, he saw not just a partner in rulership, but an equal, one whose silence spoke louder than any decree, and he for once felt almost human in her presence. The dead, of course, carried their own versions of her tale. One shade claimed she once sat among them, listening to their old songs, humming softly. Another swore she touched his hand before he crossed into forgetfulness, granting him a moment of peace. Whether these stories were true mattered less than the comfort they gave, for in her eternity felt less like a prison and more like a passage. And so the underworld, once a place of dread, grew strangely alive under her reign. Not cheerful, no. Shadows remained shadows, but touched with dignity, softened with care. Asphodel fields bloomed a little fuller, the torches glowed a little warmer, and somewhere in the silence, laughter was heard, faint but real. Still, the story continues, for even balance must be tested, and the Queen of Two Worlds would not remain untouched by the schemes of gods and the desires of mortals. Her journey was far from over. Time flows strangely in the underworld, sometimes like a slow candle flame, other times like shadows racing across cold stone floors, and in this rhythm she walked her dual corridors, feeling both the warmth of life above and the solemn chill below. Some days she wandered the quiet halls, the torchlight flickering across intricate carvings that no mortal ever noticed. Each figure seemed to lean closer when she passed, whispering secrets as if the walls themselves had a voice. Cerberus padded along behind, his triple head snuffling curiously at the hem of her cloak. One head yawned, the other tried to lick her cheek. The third, well, it just glared at an empty corner, convinced some shade owed it an apology. Her companions were not limited to guardians and ghosts. Hecate, the goddess of crossroads, often lingered at thresholds, holding her lanterns and speaking in riddles. One must choose which path to follow, but sometimes, she said with a sly grin, choosing nothing is still a choice. The queen merely raised an eyebrow, letting her cloak trail behind her like a ribbon of dusk. Hecate's lanterns cast dancing shadows that looked like miniature constellations, and if you looked closely they almost winked at her. Even Orpheus visited once, strumming a lyre so mournful that the stones themselves seemed to lean in. He pleaded for permission to retrieve Eurydice, a bold request really, because death rarely gives second chances. She listened carefully, fingers brushing a pomegranate on her belt as if it held the answer, and then, with a soft smile, she granted him a pause. Not full permission, mind you, but enough to test his resolve. Orpheus left convinced that she held both mercy and subtle trickery, and perhaps he was right. Meanwhile, the stories of Pirate House and Theseus unfolded in whispers. Two mortal heroes who had dared to enter the underworld for love or hubris. They shuffled in, hearts pounding like hammers on bronze, expecting terror, expecting wrath. Instead, they found calm guidance, subtle tests, and, oddly, tea made from roots that smelled faintly of spring. The Furies hovered, eager for drama, but she had taught them that not all mistakes demanded eternal shrieking. Sometimes, a gentle sigh and a lesson were enough, and yet she could be playful, in the way that only someone walking both worlds can. A soul would complain about eternal boredom, and she'd suddenly appear, twirling among the columns, scattering asphodel petals in a dance that made the ghosts blink. "Cheer up," she whispered. "You're dead, yes, but not unimportant." And the ghost would giggle quietly, if a ghost can giggle, which is harder than it sounds. Imagine muffled laughter echoing through eternity, like a wind brushing over cobblestones. Of course, humour alone does not run the underworld. The subtle games of politics required care. Even Hades himself occasionally grumbled at her interventions. "Must you make everything reasonable?" he asked one evening, adjusting a scroll with visible frustration. She only smiled, the kind of smile that said, "I must, or things would be unbearable down here." And in that gentle smile lay a quiet triumph, one that no decree or thunderbolt could ever capture. Above, Demeter's grief still painted the seasons in shifting brushstrokes. But the girl who once wandered meadows with wildflowers now understood the ebb and flow of sorrow. She could feel her mother's pain as if it were a cloak draped over her shoulders, and sometimes she would whisper advice from below, guiding her mother to temper her grief. "A little warmth in winter will not spoil the crops," she'd murmur, and Demeter would pause, exhaling storms with slightly less fury. Even mortals noticed. Their songs changed subtly. They spoke of the Queen of Dual Realms, the maiden whose presence rippled through both life and death. They left offerings not only in fields but also at doorways, hoping their whispered thanks reached the one who watched from the shadows. And perhaps in some quiet moment she bent low to hear them, her hands brushing a blossom or a fading leaf, a silent acknowledgement of their existence. There were lessons to be learned about balance, about duty, about walking between worlds without losing oneself. She taught them all, without ever raising her voice, without ever demanding awe. The power lay not in commanding, but in presence, a presence so complete that even the most stubborn river of lament or the sharpest furies softened. And humor, of course, never left her side. Even Hades had to admit that watching her orchestrate the underworld with a delicate joke here, a teasing glance there, was unexpectedly enjoyable. Cerberus would occasionally roll over, looking suspiciously pleased, as if understanding some private joke. And even the judges, those pillars of strict justice, found themselves chuckling quietly at her subtle ironies. She grew into her full authority, not with fanfare, not with fire, but quietly, patiently, lovingly, guiding souls, tempering grief, celebrating fleeting joys, and keeping an eye on the very mortal world that her mother governed. And every step she took reminded all of the delicate balance she maintained, the invisible thread tying life and death, spring and winter, laughter and sighs. In these days of measured triumph, the duality became her rhythm, and the world, both above and below, learned to bend to her gentle touch. But even serenity holds moments of suspense, for the gods still schemed, the mortals still hoped, and the shadows still whispered secrets she had yet to uncover. And in the quiet corridors of eternity, she walked on. The ruler who laughed softly, listened deeply, and knew that every choice, every step, carried the weight of two worlds. The rhythm of the realms had settled into a quiet cadence, not rigid, not entirely predictable, but flowing like honey over warm stone. Above, fields ripened, winds whispered through golden wheat. Below, shadows hummed softly, a lullaby for those who lingered between life and memory. She moved among them both with grace, one moment brushing petals in sunlit meadows, the next tracing corridors of obsidian stone, fingertips grazing torches that flickered like distant stars. The dual crowns she bore were not burdens, they were instruments, tuned delicately to the pulse of existence itself. Even Cerberus had adjusted to her tempo. The three heads no longer argued over who sniffed first. Instead, they walked in almost perfect synchrony, each snuffle and yawn harmonizing with the rhythm of her steps. Occasionally, one head would nudge a stubborn ghost, reminding them to hurry along, and the queen would shoot a glance that said, softly but firmly, "Do behave, or I will rearrange your eternity." Her mother Demeter began to understand the quiet power in compromise, not the flashy kind that demands attention, but the subtle influence that shapes worlds without anyone noticing. They communicated through winds and riverbanks, through shifts in light and the faint scent of pomegranate blossoms. Each exchange was a gentle reminder that even divine grief could soften with patience. And oh, the humour never ceased. The Furies tried repeatedly to stir chaos, only to be met with clever distractions. A rogue spirit tried to sneak past her judgment. She sent it back with an ornate scroll stamped with "read carefully" or "suffer etiquette classes." Even Hades occasionally snorted in disbelief, pretending it was dust in his nose. Somewhere in the midst of this calm mastery, she discovered the joy of small, imperceptible acts, a flick of a torch to guide a wandering soul, a gentle laugh at a shade's absurd complaint, the subtle tilt of a lyre string to cheer a weary poet. Each moment reinforced the truth she had always known. Influence, patience, and humour often wield more power than fear. Orpheus returned once more, daring to test his luck again. She let him wander, not because she owed mercy, but because she found amusement in watching mortal courage navigate her quiet labyrinth. His music flowed, melancholic yet tender, touching stones, shadows, and leaves alike. And she, standing slightly to the side, allowed herself a faint, ironic smile. For in guiding him, she guided herself as well. Time, though slow below, passed differently above. Mortals learned the cycles intimately. Fields ripened, leaves fell, rivers swelled and receded. Yet through it all, whispers of the Queen of Two Worlds travelled unseen. She became a myth alive, both feared and cherished, a presence felt in both sighs of wind and the hush of shaded groves. And then there were moments of pure whimsy. Cerberus would chase a mischievous shade around a corner. The shades would chase each other, laughing softly as if discovering joy for the first time. She would sometimes join in, twirling among shadows, the torchlight glinting like fireflies caught in a net. Even the stern judges could not resist letting their forms wobble slightly in amusement. Her reign, gentle yet firm, brought balance, and yet she never claimed perfection. She merely observed, nudged, and guided. Her laughter echoed softly, a reminder that life and death are not opposites, but two notes in a single endless melody. And in quiet moments she would sit by the river Styx, toes skimming the water, Cerberus at her side, tail flicking, the flames from above mingling with shadows from below. She whispered to herself, to the winds, to the unseen. Two worlds, one passage, and yet it feels like home. Above, the fields waited for spring. Below, the shadows waited for guidance. And she, smiling faintly, understood the gentle paradox, that belonging is never complete in one place alone, and that perhaps it never should be. She had crossed thresholds, negotiated with gods, soothed grieving mortals, outwitted impatient shades, and ruled with a humour so light it barely disturbed the stillness. Yet in all of it, she remained tender, observant, and quietly triumphant. The seasons, the souls, the gods, and the mortals all moved in her rhythm, a dance of life and death, laughter and sighs. She was not merely a queen, she was a bridge, a whisper, a gentle guiding flame in corridors of eternity. And so, as torchlight flickered and stars winked unseen through the cracks of heaven and earth, she sat, balancing her dual crowns with a subtle ironic grace, smiling, breathing, knowing that the passage between worlds is not merely a journey, but a quiet, whimsical mastery. The story lingers here, not because it is unfinished, but because some tales, like soft music, are meant to echo indefinitely. And with that, if you listen closely, you may hear the faint footsteps on cold stone floors, a chuckle from the shadows, and a sigh of wind through golden wheat, reminding you that the Queen of Two Worlds still walks, still watches, and still wields her gentle humour over life, death, and everything in between.